Some neighbors complained about barking dogs or loud music. But when Karen saw what her poor neighbor was hiding behind that old red barn, she called 911, thinking she was saving the neighborhood. What she didn't know was she just made the biggest mistake of her life. If you love intense HOA drama stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and let us know in the comments how you deal with a Karen like this. The morning sun rose over the quiet edges of Willow Creek Estates, where towering fences and manicured lawns painted a perfect suburban dream. But just beyond the reach of regulation, where HOA control couldn't dictate color schemes or garden gnomes, lived a man the neighborhood hated to talk about. Raymond Tucker was a relic of a time before the suburb, before the board meetings and uniformity. His home sat on the last sliver of farmland surrounded by the HOA's pristine order. It was a 2-acre stretch passed down from his father, and it looked like it. The paint on the farmhouse peeled in long strips. The porch sagged slightly. To the right, an old red barn leaned stubbornly toward the east, and a rusted tractor sat sunken into the soil as if it were growing roots. But despite appearances, Raymond lived with quiet dignity. He tended to a modest garden, raised a few chickens and goats, and spent most of his time working from sunrise to sundown, untouched by the concerns of the board or the gossip of neighbors. But Margaret Delaney could not ignore him. She lived 3 houses down, across a manicured cul-de-sac, and had appointed herself as the neighborhood's guardian. Her hair was as stiff as her morals, always curled and sprayed into submission. Margaret didn't just enforce rules, she wrote new ones and campaigned for amendments. Where others saw a peaceful old man, she saw a blight. She viewed Raymond's existence as a personal attack on the order she cherished. She had fought long and hard to have Willow Creek Estates recognized as a model HOA, with articles and write-ups in local magazines. So the sight of Raymond's muddy boots and free-roaming hens offended her. Margaret began small. She filed noise complaints about the rooster that crowed at dawn, though it was half a mile away from her window. She called animal control after claiming one of his chickens had trespassed into her backyard. When that failed, she moved on to building violations, accusing him of having unauthorized structures, a compost bin, an unpainted shed. Every complaint was met with shrugs from the city or county because Raymond's land predated the HOA. But Margaret was nothing if not persistent. She began photographing his property at odd hours, submitting stacks of evidence to the board, who tried to ignore her until she forced special meetings to discuss the rural threat. Raymond knew, of course. He knew. He saw her standing behind her curtains. He watched her car pass by slowly, her phone always held up like a weapon. He'd found notes in his mailbox, anonymous and typed in bold font, demanding he'd comply with community standards. But he ignored it. Raymond had known real conflict. He had seen places where silence was a survival strategy. A little neighborhood watchdog didn't scare him. But Margaret wasn't just any watchdog. Her obsession with Raymond grew with every ignored complaint. It became a part of her identity. She told herself she was protecting the neighborhood, that she was the only one brave enough to face down the decay spreading from that farm. She began inventing infractions. She told the city he was dumping waste into the soil. She reported foul smells and strange lights in his barn late at night. When the authorities came to check, they found nothing but fertilizer, livestock, and a tired man trying to make a living. Still, Margaret escalated. One spring evening, as twilight draped the sky in deep purples and golds, Margaret stood in her backyard, binoculars in hand. Through the lens, she saw Raymond walking into the barn, carrying what looked like a long metal container. The image burned into her mind. It had to be illegal. It had to be dangerous. She snapped photos in a frenzy, her hands shaking with righteous fury. That night, she made the call. 911. What's your emergency? It's my neighbor, she said breathlessly. He's building something. Something big. There are military crates. I think he's hiding weapons or worse. There's a strange glow from the barn. I think he's dangerous. Please send someone. The operator tried to keep her calm, asked for details, but Margaret was already convinced she was the hero in a breaking news story. The dispatcher, erring on the side of caution, sent units to investigate. Not 1, not 2, but 4. Meanwhile, inside that old red barn, Raymond sat on a crate beside a space heater. A newborn calf, barely able to stand, lay bundled in straw. Raymond gently stroked its damp fur, whispering encouragement as he cleaned its face. The metal box Margaret had seen was nothing more than a portable generator, wheeled in to power heat lamps. There was no crime, no danger, only birth and life and quiet. He didn't hear the sirens at first. The wind was loud, but the lights, those he saw. Red and blue danced across the wooden walls as shadows flickered violently. Then came the shouting. Officers surrounded the barn, guns drawn, ordering him to come out with his hands raised. Raymond stepped into the light slowly, his hands up, confused, silent. The calf cried faintly behind him. What is this? He asked, his voice calm. The officers moved in quickly, cuffed him before he could speak again. They pushed past him into the barn, searching for weapons, crates, anything suspicious. They found straw, tools, feed bags, a few sealed bins of grain. One officer opened the box Margaret had seen and found nothing but a set of jumper cables and an old transistor radio. Raymond said little as they searched. One younger officer lingered at the photos tacked to the barn wall. A black and white snapshot showed Raymond in uniform, standing beside men with tactical gear. Another photo showed him shaking hands with a politician under an American flag. "Who's this?" the officer asked. Raymond shrugged. "Old days, doesn't matter anymore." Eventually they removed the cuffs. Apologies were muttered. Reports were made. No charges, no wrongdoing, just a misunderstanding. Raymond nodded silently, rubbing his wrists. He didn't look at Margaret, who stood on the sidewalk with arms crossed, watching everything like a warden inspecting her prison. As the police left and the lights faded, Raymond turned back into the barn. He sat again by the calf, placed his hand over its small chest to feel the heartbeat. He didn't curse, Margaret didn't shout, but something shifted in his eyes, like a wall being built slowly, brick by brick. He had tried to live quietly. Now, she had taken even that from him. Back in her house, Margaret wrote in her journal. Possible federal ties. She scribbled. Military connections. Dangerous. Continue monitoring. Raymond sat in his farmhouse that night, staring at an old, dusty radio on a shelf. He hadn't touched it in years. But now, the past wasn't so far away. He flipped a hidden switch behind a cabinet. A small red light blinked once, then again. In a low voice he muttered, "Might be time." Outside, the wind carried the scent of hay and rain. The neighborhood slept, unaware that a storm far greater than thunderclouds was just beginning to form. He thought staying quiet would protect him. He thought ignoring her madness would make it go away. But when flashing red and blue lights lit up his barn that night, he knew silence was no longer safety. It was a trap, and Karen had set it. If you want to see how justice unfolds in the face of cruelty, make sure to subscribe to the channel, tap the bell icon, and leave a comment below if you've ever had a neighbor cross the line. Raymond didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed with his boots still on, one hand holding a cold cup of coffee that had long since turned bitter. The encounter with the police hadn't scared him in the way it might scare most men. He'd seen too much, lived through too many war zones, and dealt with far more dangerous threats than a paranoid woman and a few officers with flashlights. But it shook him in a deeper way. It shook the idea that peace could be maintained with silence. For years, he'd lived with the belief that if he didn't engage, if he stayed out of sight and out of mind, he could hold on to what little he had left: his land, his peace, his anonymity. But Karen had cracked that illusion. She had crossed the invisible line, and Raymond knew it wouldn't be the last time. Outside, the wind had picked up. Rain lashed against the window panes, and the barn's tin roof echoed with sharp metallic percussion. The calf was still alive, but weak, and Raymond had left the heat lamp running. He glanced at the old military radio now sitting on his kitchen table. He hadn't used it in over a decade, hadn't even charged the emergency battery, but now, it glowed faintly, like an old ghost trying to speak again. The next morning brought no peace. A bright yellow citation paper was taped to his fence. "In proper agricultural maintenance," it read. Raymond stared at it in disbelief. He hadn't even seen anyone come onto his property. No warnings, no visits, just this paper, printed and sealed, with an HOA logo that technically had no jurisdiction here. He crumpled it and tossed it into the trash. An hour later, county code enforcement arrived, claiming they had received multiple anonymous complaints. The officer who stepped out of the car looked unsure, almost apologetic. As he read off the vague list: suspected runoff pollution, livestock odor beyond acceptable limits, potential zoning, non-compliant. Raymond led him around the property. The animals were healthy, the fencing secure, the land as well kept as any working farm. After 20 minutes, the officer sighed and said quietly, "This is a waste of time, sir, but I have to file the report anyway." Raymond didn't respond. He just nodded and walked back toward the barn. Across the street, Margaret delayed as Karen, to the younger neighbors who had grown tired of her control, watched everything unfold from behind her curtain. She had printed and delivered the complaint papers herself under anonymous cover. She didn't feel guilty. In her mind, she was the only one brave enough to address the threat Raymond posed. To her, his barn wasn't just an eyesore, it was a secret bunker. His calmness wasn't humility, it was menace. She told herself stories, whispering them in her journal at night: former government agent gone rogue, weapon stockpiler, sleeper cell. Each new fiction was more dramatic than the last, and each gave her more reason to escalate. She organized an emergency HOA meeting. Though Raymond's land wasn't governed by the HOA charter, she argued that its presence affected neighboring property values and community safety. "He's bringing down the entire street," she said sharply. "The smell, the traffic, the noise. It's unacceptable." Some nodded, some rolled their eyes. A few neighbors dared to speak in Raymond's defense. "He's never hurt anyone." One woman said, "He helped me pull my car out of a ditch last winter. He keeps to himself." But Margaret cut her off. "It starts like that," she snapped. "Quiet, hidden, dangerous, and then one day you wake up to a tragedy. I'm not waiting for that." Day she began circulating petitions, demands for stricter zoning enforcement, pressure on city officials, And she kept watching, kept photographing. She caught images of a black SUV parked outside Raymond's property late at night and sent them to the local sheriff. What she didn't know was that the man in the SUV wasn't a threat, he was an old colleague. Raymond had once worked as a field analyst for a federal intelligence branch, so classified it didn't have an acronym. The man in the SUV was delivering documents related to Raymond's quiet pension and the confirmation of an old favor still owed. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. But when Raymond reached out using that old frequency on the radio, the message got through. Back on the farm, Raymond spent his days working double, checking and rechecking the security of his fences, covering the barn windows, installing a new lock on the gate. He wasn't preparing for war, not yet, but he was preparing for something. He also began documenting everything, photos of citations, video recordings of every encounter, and scanned copies of every report. At night he reviewed it all, building a file as neatly organized as the dossiers he once assembled on foreign operatives. One evening, as he sat on the porch with a notepad in hand, a teenage boy from the neighborhood stopped by. He was nervous but polite. "Mr. Tucker," he said, "my dad says you used to be somebody important. Is it true?" Raymond looked up, expression unreadable. "Depends who you ask," he replied. The boy hesitated. "Ms. Delaney says you're dangerous, but I dunno. You helped us fix our fence once. I just wanted to say, not everyone here believes her." Raymond gave a slight nod. "Appreciate that," he said, voice low. The boy walked off, but the words stayed with him. Not everyone believed her, but enough did. A week later, the tension snapped again. Margaret called the police, again, this time claiming she saw armed individuals entering Raymond's barn. It looked like a paramilitary group. She whispered dramatically. They were carrying duffel bags. "He's not alone anymore. Please, send a team." Deputies arrived in full gear, prepared for a possible standoff. But again, they found nothing illegal. The armed individuals were Raymond's old friends from service, now retired, visiting for a weekend to help fix up the barn. They were quiet men with sharp eyes and the kind of calm that came from experience. They said little to the officers, who quickly realized the call was another false alarm. That night, after they left, Raymond sat in his kitchen and stared at the glowing red light on his radio. He spoke into the microphone for the first time. "In years, she's escalating," he said. "I need oversight, not intervention, yet just eyes." The response came an hour later received. "Observation team will initiate passive monitoring. Do not engage. Maintain status." Raymond shut the radio off and closed the cabinet. He looked out the window where Margaret's porch light flickered like a beacon of her obsession. It was no longer about peace. It was now about survival and timing. And Margaret Delaney had no idea how close she was to waking a sleeping lion. But when she did, there would be no warning shot. She had poked the bear one too many times. She thought the law would keep her safe, that her clipboard and HOA title gave her untouchable power. But what Karen didn't know was that some men don't need weapons to be dangerous. Some just wait and watch. If you're hooked on this HOA showdown, be sure to subscribe, ring that bell icon, and tell us in the comments what would you do if a neighbor like Karen declared war on your home. The days following the false armed response call brought a strange calm over Willow Creek Estates, the kind of uneasy stillness that comes before a storm. Raymond kept his movements methodical. At dawn, he walked his perimeter, inspecting every fence post, checking camera feeds from his solar-powered trail cams hidden in nearby trees. He replaced locks, reinforced barn hinges, and installed a second layer of motion sensors across the western border of his land closest to Margaret Delaney's property. He knew it was only a matter of time before she struck again. He could feel the rhythm of her obsession building, like pressure behind a dam. He'd spent years reading people, anticipating their next move, and Margaret was practically broadcasting hers in bold letters. Her morning walks became patrols, always with her phone raised, taking photos of everything: his truck tires, his animals, even a pile of firewood stacked by the shed. Neighbors had started whispering. Some avoided eye contact with Raymond altogether. Others offered tight, apologetic smiles. But no one stood up to Margaret publicly. Not yet. Raymond, in the meantime, made quiet preparations. He reactivated a long-unused satellite uplink hidden in a false wall of his barn and routed a low-key encrypted signal to a secured cloud network, backing up his entire surveillance grid. He started tracking every vehicle that entered and exited the neighborhood, using automated license plate readers embedded in fake birdhouses. On paper, he was still the quiet old farmer. But behind the scenes, Raymond was rebuilding the skills that once earned him top clearance in the intelligence community. And Margaret had no idea she had waged war on a man who used to dismantle spy rings for a living. Then came the anonymous flyers. Overnight, dozens of papers were slipped into mailboxes and taped to front doors. Warning: non-compliant structure endangering neighborhood stability. They included an aerial shot of Raymond's barn, a bold red circle drawn around it, and a list of exaggerated claims: toxic waste, unsanitary livestock conditions, radiation leakage. The source was unlisted, but everyone knew it was Margaret. Some residents chuckled and tossed it away, but others, those newer to the neighborhood or already uneasy with Raymond's isolation, began to murmur. One afternoon, a knock came at Raymond's door. It was a woman in her 30s with a toddler on her hip. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I don't mean to intrude. I heard some things about danger and my son plays outside. I need to know the truth." Raymond stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her calmly, then invited her to the barn. She hesitated but followed. Inside she saw nothing but order hay stacked neatly, tools lined on pegboards, animals in clean pens. He showed her the calf, now stronger, running awkward circles around its mother. "This is the danger," he said softly. She smiled awkwardly and thanked him, then left. The next day she told her neighbors. A few began to reconsider, but Margaret doubled down. She scheduled a press interview with a local paper, positioning herself as a concerned citizen fighting for safety. "I'm not trying to target anyone," she said with practiced poise. "But when someone builds a fortress in the middle of a peaceful community, we deserve answers." She provided cherry-picked photos and a dossier of complaints. The story ran with the headline, "The Barn on the Edge of the Law." Raymond read it the next morning, standing by the mailbox. He folded it neatly, walked back inside, and opened his encrypted laptop. With a few keystrokes, he accessed an old database and submitted a request labeled Public Reputation Countermeasure. Within 24 hours, a new article surfaced. Anonymous op-ed written by a concerned local veteran detailing Margaret's history of harassment, her false reports, and the baseless nature of her crusade. It included quotes from past HOA board members who had resigned under her pressure and screenshots of her obsessive emails. The story gained traction online, especially among watchdog forums who loved a good HOA villain. Margaret, sensing the shift in public sentiment, attempted damage control. She held a coffee meet in her front yard, inviting neighbors to discuss the truth, but only 3 showed up, and one of them left halfway through that evening. She stood alone on her porch watching Raymond as he fed his animals. He moved with quiet confidence, unaffected. That infuriated her more than anything. The next day, a brick was thrown through Raymond's barn window. A crude note was attached. "Get out, we know who you are." Raymond picked up the brick, read the note, and calmly placed both on a shelf in his kitchen. He didn't call the police. Instead, he retrieved a small metal case from a false bottom in the pantry. Inside was a retired federal badge, a locked flash drive, and a burner phone. He powered on the phone for the first time in years. "It started," he said. On the other end, the voice replied, "Acknowledged. Support is prepped and waiting. Say the word." "Not yet, just eyes." He turned off the phone and opened the barn's underground hatch. It wasn't a bunker, but it was a space, a secure one, with shelves, files, and tech equipment designed for contingency. For the first time, Raymond began to seriously consider using it. Meanwhile, Margaret was beginning to unravel. She paced her kitchen late at night, rewinding security footage of her own porch, convinced someone had tampered with her property. She began sleeping in the living room with her phone clutched in hand. Her world was cracking, and as much as she hated Raymond, a part of her feared him now. Then came the drone. It hovered over Raymond's barn for nearly an hour before crashing into a tree. He recovered it quietly and scanned its storage. Dozens of high-resolution images of his property, but the drone wasn't from the HOA, nor from any local source. It was military-grade surveillance tech, slightly modified, a breach of federal regulation. Raymond knew what that meant. Someone had taken Margaret's crusade and escalated it without her knowing. Maybe an opportunist, maybe someone with a grudge. He compiled the drone data, encrypted it, and sent it to the agency. That night, he received a final message. "Authorization pending. Contingency protocol may be required. Await green light." Raymond stared at the screen, then at the barn, then at the house across the road. Margaret Delaney had stirred something, far larger than she understood, and the next move wouldn't come from him, it would come from Washington. The government doesn't knock when it comes. It doesn't announce itself with flashing lights. It moves in shadows, in silence, and when Margaret Delaney finally realized who she was really dealing with, it was already too late. If you're still gripped by this HOA thriller, hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and drop a comment below. What punishment do you think a Karen like this deserves? In the early hours before dawn, 2 black SUVs rolled into Willow Creek Estates without a sound. They didn't use the main entrance. They bypassed the neighborhood completely and approached Raymond's property from the wooded rear path that bordered the creek. A team of 4 stepped out, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with precision. They weren't here for action yet. They were the kind of people who specialized in containment, in quiet observation. Raymond met them at the edge of the field before the goats had even stirred. "Too early for visitors," he said flatly. The woman in charge smiled. "Just here to keep things from boiling over, Mr. Tucker." He nodded. "Already is." She brought in a drone, military mod. The woman didn't flinch. She simply tapped her phone. "We know that's why we're here now." Surveillance picked up the signal ping. "We have reason to believe this goes beyond a nosy neighbor." Raymond arched an eyebrow. "You think someone's using her as a cover?" The woman didn't answer directly. "Just keep everything locked down. We'll be eyes and ears. You don't engage unless you're engaged. Understood?" He nodded once and walked back toward the barn. That morning, Margaret awoke to find a new car parked in her cul-de-sac, plain, gray, unmarked. She didn't recognize the driver, but the man spent a full hour on his laptop in the front seat before driving off. She called the police, of course, and they filed a non-urgent report. But when she mentioned Raymond's name, the officer on the line hesitated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we've been advised to de-escalate any calls related to that property. We recommend you do the same." Margaret's face flushed with rage. "So I'm the one who gets ignored now. I've tried to protect this community." Raymond remained silent for days. The drone incident had shifted everything. The eyes that had once been on him from across the street were now being watched themselves. Margaret had begun noticing it. The car that was always parked 2 streets over, the jogger who passed her house at the same time every morning and always looked a bit too fit, the repairman who seemed to spend too long on the neighbor's roof. She thought she was being targeted, and in a way she was, but not by Raymond. The agency had moved in to neutralize external threats, and Margaret had unknowingly triggered national-level surveillance. Her campaign had become a liability. Still, she didn't stop. That was her fatal flaw. She filed one final complaint, an official request to have Raymond's land reassessed for federal environmental violations. She claimed toxic waste was being buried on site. It triggered a mandatory federal response, and this time, the agents had no choice but to act. Raymond knew they were coming. He had 2 hours warning from an encrypted ping sent through the back channel. He didn't run, he didn't hide. Instead, he cleaned the barn, fed the animals, and made coffee. When the unmarked convoy rolled down the gravel path, he was sitting on his porch with a worn flannel shirt and an open case file beside him. The agents moved in quickly but respectfully. "Mr. Tucker," the lead investigator said, "we're here to inspect your property per the federal referral." Raymond stood up and opened the gate himself. "I've got nothing to hide." Over the next 3 hours, every inch of his property was examined. Soil samples, well-watered, barn inventory, feed, stock. The underground storage room was accessed with permission and catalogued. The agents found nothing illegal, nothing questionable. In fact, the entire property was so clean, so well documented, that the lead investigator pulled Raymond aside near the end and said, "You ran this like a field post, didn't you?" Raymond gave a faint smile. Old habits. But while the investigation cleared him, it did something more powerful. It validated the agency's internal files. Raymond wasn't just a veteran or a former analyst. He was a trusted ghost, a resource too valuable to allow under threat. The agents left with quiet nods, but not before one of them whispered, "We'll handle it." The next morning, Margaret was served, not by the HOA, not by local police, by a federal marshal. She was being investigated for filing fraudulent federal reports, harassment, and endangering the safety of a protected intelligence asset. Her face turned white as the charges were read. She tried to protest, tried to cry victim, but the marshals were expressionless. "Ma'am, this is not about HOA policy anymore. This is about national interference." The neighborhood watched from their porches as Margaret was escorted to a government vehicle. Phones recorded, whispers traveled. A woman once feared had become the story no one wanted to claim. That evening, a neighbor left a pie on Raymond's porch with a note. "Sorry we didn't stand up sooner." Raymond read it, then walked out to his field. The sun was setting, golden light washing over the barn. The calf nudged his leg and bleated softly. He crouched down, ran a hand over its head, and whispered, "You're safe now." But he wasn't. Naive, he knew Margaret was just a spark. Somewhere, someone had tried to peer too deep. The drone, the fake license plates he caught on camera days earlier, the data packets that pinged unknown servers, it meant there was a bigger game afoot. Later that night, he turned on the burner phone. "She's neutralized," he said. The voice on the other end replied, "Acknowledged. But your file's been reopened, clearance reactivated. You're not just a civilian anymore. Not after this." Raymond didn't reply. He just looked out the window as the wind pushed the barn doors gently. Peace was never permanent, and some battles find you even when you try to leave them behind. And so the farm slept, but its keeper no longer did. Not fully, not anymore. There's a moment, just before dawn, when the world forgets its chaos, a fragile hush. But Raymond Tucker knew better. Now peace was not silence. Peace was vigilance. And even with Margaret Delaney gone, the battle wasn't over. It had only evolved. If you followed this far, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon, and let us know in the comments, should Raymond walk away from the past or embrace who he really is. Weeks passed after the federal takedown of Margaret Delaney, and the neighborhood settled into a tense kind of quiet. The HOA meetings were more subdued. Neighbors who had once ignored Raymond now offered respectful waves and awkward small talk at the local market. The Delaney house sat empty, its windows covered. A for sale sign staked out front like a tombstone for a chapter best forgotten. But Raymond didn't celebrate. He watched, he listened. His instincts told him the threat hadn't vanished, had merely shifted shape. 3 days after Margaret's arrest, an unfamiliar delivery truck pulled up to the edge of Raymond's property. The driver didn't approach the door. Instead, he placed a package labeled only with a 6-digit code and drove off. Raymond retrieved it with caution. scanned it for electronics, then opened it under the barn's secure hatch. Inside were documents, maps, photos, surveillance stills of men he didn't recognize, some blurry, some clear. One image showed a man standing outside a black car near Margaret's cul-de-sac 2 weeks before the drone incident. Another showed a satellite view of Raymond's barn, annotated with tactical details. Along with the packet was a note: asset compromised, potential embedded threat, recommend you relocate or re-engage, contact protocol unchanged. Raymond closed the lid and sat in the dark, lit only by a single battery lamp. Re-engage, that one word dug into him like a blade. He had spent a decade removing himself from operations, from missions, from lies and secrets. The farm was his firewall, his sanctuary. But now, it had been breached by Karen. Yes, but also by whatever forces had piggybacked on her obsession. That night, he didn't sleep. He pulled out the old case files, cross-checked the photos, connected faces to places, movements to patterns. What emerged was a chilling theory. Margaret's campaign might have started as petty control, but it had drawn attention from opportunists, people looking to exploit his position, his background, perhaps even frame him. He had seen such tactics before. Leak a fake report, stir up suspicion, force a surveillance warrant, then use it to extract or plant whatever was needed. It wasn't HOA drama anymore. It was TRA drama anymore. It was TRADECRAFT. By morning, Raymond made a decision. He contacted the agency using an untraceable voice relay and requested limited activation status. Not full reinstatement. Not yet, but enough to allow access to protected databases and counter-surveillance tools. The reply came quickly: clearance granted. Use at your discretion. He began reinforcing the barn's underground room into a command hub. Antennas, encrypted routers, radio sweeps. He mapped out the neighborhood, plotted field of view arcs and marked potential blind spots. He created a behavioral log for vehicles and foot traffic. His animals grazed in peace above, but beneath their hooves. Intelligence operations stirred. Then, just as things began to stabilize, a second event unfolded. One evening, a teenage neighbor came up the gravel path to Raymond's porch, pale and shaking. "Sir, I think someone's in the Delaney house. I saw a light inside. Movement. No one's supposed to be there." Raymond moved fast. He grabbed a thermal scope from a hidden drawer and scanned the property across the way. 3 heat signatures, one by the window, one near the basement, the third. Moving upstairs, he activated a silent alarm via his phone. It pinged a secure agency endpoint and flagged the coordinates. Within minutes, he received a reply: team dispatched. Maintain observation. He did exactly that. When the SUV rolled in 10 minutes later, the operatives moved with surgical precision. The intruders were extracted in less than 3 minutes. Raymond watched from the shadows, identifying one of the men from the surveillance photos. Confirmed. The Delaney house had become a staging point. The following day, Raymond was briefed via encrypted chat. Unauthorized foreign operatives. Objective unknown. Surveillance breached by civilian interference. Containment achieved. Asset remains high risk. Raymond closed the laptop. He stepped onto the porch and looked out over the land. His land, the goats were grazing. The calf had grown strong, playful now. Life continued, but under it pulsed something darker. In the days that followed, Raymond prepared for the final stage. He compiled a full report, audio, video, metadata, data dating the escalation from Margaret's initial harassment to the foreign surveillance breach. He transmitted it to the highest level of agency review. Flagged CivSec compromise, domestic interference, triggering foreign espionage. The response was swift. Report received. Operation reclassified. You are to remain in place. Full covert status reinstated. Home designation resecured as safe post. Raymond understood what that meant. He wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was now the center of a reactivated node in a growing web of domestic intelligence. And this time, it wasn't because he wanted it. It was because the world had dragged him back in. As night fell over Willow Creek Estates, Raymond sat beside the barn, his dog curled at his feet. He sipped black coffee and watched the stars, the breeze rustling the trees like whispers from a past he could never quite escape. Somewhere out there, more eyes were watching, more enemies probing, but they'd have to get through him first. Because Margaret Delaney had made the mistake of treating Raymond like a farmer. But the world was about to learn he was far more than that, and this time, the gloves were off. The HOA had no idea how lucky they were that he still believed in peace. For now,